AMNT. With my co-chair, Janice Turner, I welcome you to the webinar today. And we're delighted to have Guy Opperman MP, Minister for Pensions and Financial Inclusion, as our keynote speaker. We mark two events. Firstly, earlier this year, Guy became overall the second longest serving of all pensions ministers, so we congratulate him. And secondly, this autumn, AMNT reached its 10th anniversary, so you congratulate us as well as Guy. And we celebrate both of those events today. I can report that our association is in good order. We've adapted well to working in the new order of COVID-19 pandemic lockdown. Our staple inevitably has moved from the quarterly all-day conferences to the one or two topic webinars like this. And since the spring, we've run 14 of these. So you can see that we've been able to keep up our record of activities. Our membership continues to grow, up by 16% in the last 12 months, despite the COVID lockdown. So we now represent pension schemes with assets under management of just under 1 trillion GBP pounds sterling. So that's a big slice of the UK occupational pension sector. We've just completed a detailed survey of our members, so send in for a copy. It shows how clearly we, the member nominateds, make valuable and cost-effective contributions to our individual schemes. Our overall message remains as it has always been throughout our 10 years. That is that democracy and pension scheme governance, plus well-trained and competent trustees, equals good member outcomes. The Minister sent us a kind message on our 10 years. We're grateful for his official recognition of our unique position in pensions, with our prime focus on representing members themselves rather than provider interests. Guy picked up 3 achievements in particular: raising standards of trusteeships, vital and independent voice in pensions governance, and the third one, he said, uncanny knack of identifying both issues and solutions ahead of the pack. And currently in Parliament, we give well-regarded evidence to the Work and Pensions Select Committee on pension scams. So you see that our activities cover both training and campaigning. Today's agenda covers both parts. In part 1, the Minister will speak first. He will then answer some questions. And in part 2, Janice will introduce AMNT's groundbreaking work on voting rights of trustees as asset owners. So firstly, the Minister for Pensions, Guy Opperman. Guy, to you.
David, thank you very, very much indeed. Thank you, Janice. Thank you to everybody from the AMNT for inviting me to speak to you once more. I well remember it was October 2019 that I spoke to you on the last occasion in the City of London on a very windy day opposite the Lloyd's building. And my lordy, a lot has changed since then. Clearly, we've had a general election, and I was delighted to be reappointed as Pensions Minister after the December election. It is a job I asked to do at the start. It remains a job I really enjoy and I believe is worth doing. It is something very, very important to do this job. And I'm honoured and privileged that it is me taking it forward. I also believe that we managed to do a great deal, not least of which is almost completing the Pension Schemes Bill, which, as you know, I believe will make our pensions safer, better and greener. And it is definitely the case that we managed to progress legislation notwithstanding the impact of COVID. And I realised that for all of us, things have become much less certain, and this is causing great uncertainty and very difficulty for many people. Certainly, I experience it as a constituency MP, as every constituency MP does. So, the government is trying to do whatever it can to get us through this crisis. We are genuinely starting to see light at the end of the tunnel, but none of us are under any illusions that there are still several months of slog ahead. And I want to thank all of you what you are doing individually and collectively. I also want to wish AMNT many happy returns. and thank all of you, obviously the leaders of the organisation, but all of you, for offering a genuinely innovative and vital and independent voice in pensions governance. This has unquestionably raised the standards of trusteeship with independent training and awareness sessions. But as David just mentioned, I genuinely believe the AMNT is very well placed at identifying both issues and then potential solutions on key problems, whether that is collective DC, on ESG, or on pooled fund voting, as we're going to talk about today. So the bill itself, I believe, has taken things forward in a safer, better, greener way. David mentioned the work that he's doing with the Work and Pension Select Committee, who I'm working absolutely hand in glove with to ensure that we are combating scams and giving occupational pension schemes measures to ensure transfers of pension savings are made in a safe way and not into fraudulent schemes. There is a whole host of measures that derive from section 125 of the bill that we feel will make pensions a great deal safer. Clearly, I think the pensions will be better. It is a combination of a huge amount of work by the team at DWP, and I speak as someone from speaking in Caxton Houses at the moment. But I'm very, very grateful to all the bill team for all the work they've done and all the policy teams, whether it is developing collective defined contributions. I think CDCs is a new product which will be a fantastic assistance to many going forward, whether it is delivering on our legislation for pensions dashboard to make savers better informed on how their money is growing and how they can understand what they have, and also the work we've done on the DB white paper and all the reforms that flow from that. And finally, I think it is a greener bill because for the first time, obviously we are the government who was the first government of the G7 to legislate to put net zero on the statutory book by 2050. There's no question in my mind, having spoken in Europe with European colleagues, that we lead the way on ESG. And we now have a situation where we are the first country in the world to put TCFD onto the statute book. And I genuinely believe that we are putting climate change at the heart of pensions going forward. And I think that is a very good thing, and it will be something that we build upon going forward. I touch upon a couple of other clauses in the bill before I get on to the substance of the report that we're going to talk about today. On clause 107, I know that some trustees have some concern about this, but I just want to reassure you once again that there is no intention to frustrate legitimate business activity where they're conducted in good faith. And the bill itself makes it clear that offence is only committed if the person did not have a reasonable excuse for doing the act or engaging in the course of conduct. And on clause 123, the measures in the bill seek to support trustees and employers. It builds upon the work that we've done for some considerable period of time. And I will be bringing forward secondary legislation which will work in such a way that it does not prevent appropriate open schemes for investing in riskier investments where there are potentially higher returns, as long as the risks being taken can be supported and members' benefits and the PPF are effectively protected. There is, I repeat, no desire to see open schemes close unnecessarily. Now I'll turn to the MNT report on bringing shareholder voting into the 21st century. This one here, it is something that I believe is genuinely a very important piece of work. I first spoke on this issue of trustee voting policies in February 2018 at the TUC Pensions Conference. I think I've spoken more at the TUC Pensions Conference than anybody else. It's probably because most people think I'm not one of the most left-wing Tories around, but whether I'm invited back in the spring, we'll see. But at the time, I remarked on the key fact that when many schemes, especially DC schemes, invest in equities, they invest alongside others, ultimately in pooled funds. Now, many DB schemes invest in the same way too, and I queried why it was a precondition when schemes invest in this way that they surrender voting rights. They get to choose the manager and the fund, and with it the investment manager, but they don't get to choose how to vote at annual general meetings for the company's shares they hold. So at the time I posed three questions, and I think it's worth contextualizing what we're doing today. First, I asked if this was a technology problem and why fund managers or others couldn't fix the technology. Secondly, I queried why, if this was all about asset managers thinking it was better to speak with one voice, what was so wrong with communicating that your investors have a diversity of views? And thirdly, I wondered why, if this practice was in some way legally questionable, why some investment managers are letting some clients vote their shares in pooled funds. On the question of tech, I do have a FinTech guide published earlier this year, I believe, by the Investment Association, the trade body for fund managers, which remarks that historically, investment and wealth management is a sector that has been slow to adapt emergent technology. That certainly does appear to be the case. On the importance of speaking with one voice, I also have the Law Commission's report on intermediated securities, which was published only last month, which quotes the fund industry line on pooled fund and voting, but remarks dryly that this approach assumes that the decision on whether to exercise voting rights to influence a company is one solely for the asset manager and does not consider the wishes or objectives of the ultimate investor. Which is certainly an interesting conclusion when Principle 6 of the excellent updated version of the Financial Reporting Council Stewardship Code, which managers are expected to sign up to on a comply and explain basis, requires that signatory fund managers must explain how they have sought and received clients' views and how assets have been managed in alignment with client stewardship and investment policy. In some cases, not at all appears to be the answers to both questions. And on the legalities, the asset managers who allow trustees to set their own voting policies remain at large, committing no greater crime than empowering pension scheme trustees and delivering better outcomes. Indeed, I understand that more are set to come forward with innovative offerings. I strongly welcome that. So I'm grateful to the AMNT for this excellent new report written by Professor Clayshire, who's on the call, I know, which sets out proposals for a new working group to examine the overly complex and archaic voting infrastructure, underinvestment in the stewardship function in fund management, transparency of voting policies and outcomes, scheme-specific reporting requirements. And I'm pleased to announce the establishment of that group today, the Task Force on Pension Scheme Voting Implementation. This will be a task and finish group with a focused remit to look at how we facilitate the delivery of solutions to voting system issues which overcome the present obstacles to trustees implementing their own policies. Secondly, how we increase the number of asset managers who are prepared to engage with their clients' preferences and follow, or as a minimum, align or explain on trustee voting policies, including via pooled arrangements. And thirdly, where you could recommend regulatory and non-regulatory measures to ensure the convergence of asset managers' approaches to voting policy and execution with trustees' policies and their preferences, especially in pooled funds. I'm also able to announce today the appointment of Simon Howard, who's also on this call, and you're going to hear from him later, until very recently the CEO of the UK Sustainable Investment and Finance Association as chair, and Sarah Wilson, the CEO of Minerva Analytics, as the vice chair. Both come with a long pedigree, and many of you will be familiar with their work. Simon and his organisation have done sterling work in promoting the importance of ESG and responsible investment more broadly, and have done excellent work on pensions, including their report Changing Course earlier this year. And as a result, I'm taking forward their recommendations of a central directory of statements of investment principles supported by the TPR and the DWP. We also need a long-standing champion of the asset owner voice in voting, and I cannot improve on Sarah Wilson, who's the Chief Executive of Minerva Analytics. She was awarded the Excellence in Corporate Governance Award from the International Corporate Governance Networks for her efforts to improve the essential infrastructure that underpins effective corporate governance and investor stewardship. The group will also include representatives of the AMNT, with the rest of the membership to be announced in due course. The group will be supported by the DWP, but independent of the DWP. I've also asked the group to support and advise on the development of voting policies for occupational pension schemes and further proposals for better disclosure of votes in a standardised and comparable way, which allows trustees and ultimately savers to see the quality of the service they are getting. I want genuinely this to be a standardised approach across the board. In the final minutes of my remarks, let me explain why I think this step is important. It's simple. The investment chain is very long and at times very tangled, but ultimately you as trustees of pension schemes are the asset owners at the end of that chain. And when you act, the ownership chain is tighter. That means better governance of firms in the real economy, more sustainable value creation, and better outcomes for your savers. And when trustees invest, too often they're being asked to select funds in advance on sometimes non-committal voting policies and historic voting records, which are opaque, inconsistent, and sometimes incomplete. So that's why I've spoken a few times about a mixed economy in voting. The ability for trustees to set their own granular voting policy where they wish, and to expect to be able to find a manager who is willing to implement it at a fair price. Trustee voting policies more generally do need to improve. We urgently need to call time on SIP statements like, "We leave it all to our fund managers." But I see no reason why trustees shouldn't be able to determine a high-level policy, find an asset manager whose policy reflects it, and appoint that manager to implement their own policy. But we'll get more engagement, better stewardship, better outcomes, and a stronger economy where asset owners who want to have a voice are able to speak up, however they invest, including in pooled funds, rather than be suppressed. It should not necessarily be the case that they need to switch to segregated mandates to set such a policy. For many schemes, such as DC schemes investing via platforms, this will be impractical. I'm determined that this does work, and I believe that it will. I realise that we all could sit back and do nothing, and one firm could emerge with some great innovation to make voting in pooled funds a practical reality. But I don't think it is right to sit back. Longer term, we need more than one or two firms to come forward. I accept that the market will provide innovative solutions, but if we're to make it happen, trustees need to use their buying power now. I would invite you to tell your advisor, remember they are an advisor and you are the decision maker, that you're switching to a fund manager that will honour your policy unless similar flexibility is granted at pace by your current manager. I'd invite you not to take no for an answer. Don't tell me that the consultants won't sign off unless you pay them handsomely, as it is, to certify that a more effective voting policy is in your members' interests. Actually, do tell me, and I will tell the whole world. This system, a network of computers saying no to one another, a long system of blocked pipework, needs to be unblocked to allow trustees' votes, and maybe eventually their beneficiaries' votes, to be those that are counted by the companies they own. I rule nothing out in making this work properly. To my mind, this will make pensions safer, because if we give trustees a voice on voting, we can expect tougher action on pay for failure. The current tangled investment chain means that signals are far too often too weak, with sadly only 50 UK listed votes on remuneration scoring dissent of above 20% and only 5 defeated. I think it'll make pensions better, because pension scheme membership is about more representative of the population than the fund management industry. And because trustees are ultimately accountable to their savers, they're going to be much better at pressing for boards who are more representative of the people who invest with them. In contrast, AMNT research last year found that 30% of fund managers had no voting policy on diversity and 75% had no policy on ethnic diversity. Trustees can do better than this. And I believe it will make pensions greener, because for however much progress we have made, we do have further to go. Edelman found 69% of institutional investors wanted companies to tie executive pay to sustainability, and yet almost no company does. Why is that? Sir Christopher Horn of the Children's Investment Fund Foundation has described asset managers as sheep and highlighted that a lot of them will say, "We will vote for someone else's resolution." But why aren't they filing their own resolutions? I think that is a fair question. Engaged trustees can table their own resolutions and genuinely make a change in terms of voting. The Investment Association paper on fintech that I quoted earlier said that for tech adoption to succeed, there must be a clear, specific business problem to solve, together with an organisational culture and multi-level sponsorship that supports innovation. I believe this is a specific business problem crying out for a solution, which will allow asset owners to take ownership of their asset, however they invest. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much indeed, Guy, for that overview of the pension scene. We give you a round of applause, but we're unfortunately all muted at the moment.
Understood.
But I think you kindly have an opportunity to answer a few questions for us before the parliamentary timescale takes you away. Janice, do you have some questions that were sent in advance?
Yes, thank you very much, David, and Guy. Congratulations on a wonderful speech. Thank you so much for the words that you've said. So yeah, we've had quite a few questions that have come in, and the first one that I've got here is it's actually it's arising, I think, from your comments earlier. This person's saying, my investment consultant hasn't even mentioned the idea of my pension scheme having its own voting policy. When I asked them, they said that the fund managers wouldn't accept it because we invest in pooled funds, so there isn't much point. So what do you say to that? Well,
I think start with tell them about this initiative. And I think, bless you both for your kind comments, I should have said at the start. It is genuinely a pleasure to work with you, because I think the planets are aligned as to where we are headed. So I think tell them about this initiative, ask them whether they've read this report. Frankly, it's a pretty good start, because if they haven't read the report, I slightly wonder what they're doing. And then I suppose tell them that you want to set a voting policy, and you're going to ask asset managers to respond to that voting policy. And I believe the trustees have so much more power than they think, is what I think. And I think this will give them an ability to exercise that power. And I genuinely believe that there is also, there is the third option, that you can switch to one of the funds that have emerged that allow you to set your own voting policy. And I strongly believe that asset managers are going to look at this and they can make a strategic choice. Are we going to be the one that empowers trustees, or are we going to be the one that doesn't empower trustees? And I think that strategic choice will have consequences for the asset managers.
Question 2, Janice. I think you've got a...
Yes. So we've got another one that says, we appreciate and commend you for listening to AIBT's concerns on this important issue.
That's the toady one.
What is your top priority for this task force to have addressed in the next year?
I'm a conservative, so I think the key word will be choice. I'm not a pension scheme trustee, and I appreciate it as an exceptionally difficult and important job, but I want there to be a choice for a trustee as to where the investment can go. And I think this report, what we've announced as a working group today, which I don't think I could give it much more force behind it than I have done, will genuinely change things. And my hope is that relatively soon in 2021, the working group is going to come back to me and say, look, these are what we have found. This is what we believe needs to change. And this is how we are creating choice. And we are all believers in the market. I'm just not sure the market is working at the present stage, because I don't think there is the choice that I would like there to be for trustees. That's what I would like to see change. And I think just to follow on from that, that choice, in my view, will bring better outcomes, is the key point.
I think we've got time for one more question. Given the complications that trustees face in getting their policies implemented by fund managers, what are your thoughts on the current interest in pension scheme beneficiaries being able to get their views heard, as championed by such campaigns as Make Your Money Matter or Tumalo?
So we debated this as part of Section 124 of the Pension Schemes Bill in the House a couple of weeks ago, and I wrote a detailed piece on this in the Sunday Times about 10 days ago, and it's my pinned tweet. For those of you on social media and you want to see my views on this particular issue in more detail, then you can read the article in the Sunday Times, which is my pinned tweet. I suppose, so I've met Make My Money Matter and many of the organisations who support this particular line of argument. And there's a balance here, because anything that energises people as to an understanding and an appreciation of what their pension is something I massively applaud and appreciate. And there is no question that what Richard Curtis and others are doing to engage people with what they have as their pension is something we massively support. What I don't support, sadly, is their approach in terms of things like divestment, their approach in terms of mandation, breach of fiduciary duty. And there is no doubt that the position that they take, some of these organisations, would breach fiduciary duty, would lead to divestment, and would actually push us away from the outcome that we're all seeking, which is more empowered trustees, enabling pension schemes to be better invested and to be motivating individual companies to change, with an ultimate desire to get us to net zero by 2050. Now, I think we're engaging with these organisations. I'm afraid I think they are misguided on that one particular point. I've set out my views in detail in the Times. I set out my views in the House, and the House of Commons emphatically agreed with me. But I think also pension schemes trustees agree with me, but they don't want fiduciary duty to be breached. They don't want to be mandated to do things. What they do want, as the PLSA set out in detail when considering this particular point, what they do want is a clear roadmap, whether it is on ESG, whether it is on TCFD, whether it is on the Pension Schemes Bill, Section 124, and the work that we're doing. And I'd like to think the work that we're doing here, because this gives powers to and an enablement to the trustees to have greater strength in negotiations with asset managers. And this is the key battle ahead, in my view. It's one of many, but it is one of the key battles that lie ahead of ensuring that trustees are in charge here going forward. Now, my apologies. You've hit me on a very, very, very busy parliamentary day. So I'm not going to be able to stay for this. I want to thank all the team from AMNT. I'm going to put you in the safe hands of David and Janice, and obviously Simon and Sarah and the team. And my officials will remain on the call to listen in and to keep the learning going. But I appreciate the work you're doing. Keep up the great work. I realise it is very difficult times that we're all living in, and we are all trying to do our best just to keep going. It's much appreciated. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Guy, for your participation in our event. We appreciate the parliamentary timetable at the moment, and we wish you Godspeed in your work and your next commitments. Thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning. Which takes us now to Janice, who will talk more about the report which Guy has just mentioned.
Great, thank you very much, David. Yes, well, as David was saying, I mean, today is a great day for the Association of Member Nominated Trustees. It's 10 years since a dozen of us sat round a table and discussed whether we should set up this association. A decade later, we now have a membership of more than 750 member nominated trustees from more than 500 pension schemes that, as David just said, they have a collective assets of almost £1 trillion. At that meeting 10 years ago, the arguments I put forward in favour of setting up AMNT were that at the time there really wasn't any way that ordinary trustees could get their voice heard by the regulator or the government. And there were many issues facing us that were far bigger than one single pension scheme could address. In fact, I remember being told at my trustee board meeting one time that a new regulation or law or tax change had come in that would adversely affect our scheme, and thinking, nobody ever asked us what we thought. So over the years, AMNT has taken action to get your voice heard on a whole range of issues. And I've been very pleased that we have been listened to, and never more than this year. Many of you will remember the shareholder spring of 2012, when the newspapers were full of reports that many shareholders had got fed up of company bosses stratospheric and had started voting against them at company AGMs. Many pension trustees, including me, agreed and asked our investment consultants and fund managers to ensure that our shareholder votes were used to support this action. But we were told that we couldn't say how our votes could be used because, like most pension schemes, we invest in pooled funds. So AMNT started talking to the fund managers about this. And at the time, they said that in pooled funds, many investors pool their money and the fund managers operate the votes associated with these investments collectively. They said there was no demand from clients to be able to dictate the voting policy of their assets. But if we created the demand, they would act. So AMNT took up the challenge to create that demand. Having researched the market in great detail, I might add, we could find no comprehensive voting policy covering the full range of environmental, social and governance issues. So we spent 2 years consulting our members and the financial services industry and developed our own, which we called Red Line Voting. It includes all the major issues of concern to investors. On climate change, we had the benefit of advice from specialists such as the Carbon Disclosure Project. pension schemes could adopt these policies and ask their fund managers to operate them on a comply or explain basis. We expected the fund managers to engage and vote according to our policies, but they were free to vote contrary to these policies, so long as they explained to us why they'd done so. Now, we know that after we launched our red lines at the end of 2015, many pension schemes did adopt them. Shocked when major fund accept our policies. So we studied the fund managers' own policies and were disappointed to find that most were way behind ours. For example, not even mentioning climate change, or when they did mention it, they had either weak or non-existent recommendations on how to vote at an AGM when a company was failing to play its part in countering this global emergency that will hit all our pension schemes if we don't succeed. Our conclusion was that many fund managers had poor policies and they refused to adopt their clients' more progressive policies. But because this rejection was across the board, pension schemes had nowhere else to go. The market had failed the asset owners. So we commissioned Professor Ian Clatcher of Leeds University to examine in great detail the arguments put forward by the fund management industry as to why they could not implement trustee voting policies. We did this in partnership with two important bodies campaigning for sustainability in investing, the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment and the United Kingdom Sustainable Investment and Finance Association, called UCSIF. And I want to congratulate Dr. Clatcher on a wonderful piece of work. He devoted a huge amount of time consulting the entire voting chain and both asset managers and asset owners. Ian is going to talk about the study and the recommendations, but as you've heard, our key recommendation was that the government should set up a working group to finally sort out this issue. And we at AIM have been absolutely delighted that the government has listened to us, accepted our recommendation, and as you've just heard from the Pensions Minister, they are indeed setting up this group. And they couldn't have picked a better chair than Simon Howard, who until he retired a few weeks ago was the Chief Executive of UCSIF. And we'll be hearing from Simon as well shortly. As trustees, I'm sure you'll share our view that being able to set our own voting policy and have it implemented by fund managers is a really important protection for our assets. We need serious policies to make the corporate world take greater action on issues that will ultimately lead to greater sustainability for our investments. Our climate change policy is aligned with the tiny number of fund managers' policies that share our concern. Our policy of ethnicity on boards will help Black Lives Matter reach where long-term asset owners and the world needs it to reach, into the boardroom. Our policies on audit will work towards breaking the monopoly of the 4 big accountancy companies, an issue which most fund managers whose policies we have studied are not taking seriously. And on the issue where we came in 8 years ago, executive pay, widespread adoption of our voting policies would do something serious about the pathetically small votes against obscene executive pay deals, particularly at a time when so many workers are suffering major hits to their income. And everybody can still download our red lines from redlinevoting.org. So if your pension scheme doesn't have a voting policy, that's the place to start. So the AMNT wants to give the government our real thanks for coming so squarely on our side, accepting AMNT's recommendations and taking action to set up a committee aiming to finally help us solve this issue after 8 years of campaigning. This is a wonderful way to celebrate 10 years of the Association of Member-Nominated Trustees. So moving swiftly on, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Ian Clatcher of Leeds University, who is now going to take the floor and tell us more about the survey.
Thank you, Janice, and thank you everybody for joining this morning to listen. I've got two small slides to share. So if somebody can confirm that this is up and running, excellent. It's very odd, all this technology. You wouldn't think I run a centre on fintech. So the first thing I've got to do is say thank you to everybody who was involved in this, and that's everybody who spent time with me and very generously gave me the wealth of their experience, from asset owners through to custodians, fund managers, because everybody very diligently and carefully set out the barriers as they see them. And what it allowed me to do is produce a very dry report, because nobody's interested in the plumbing. And that's how I sort of view the report. This is about the plumbing of the fund management industry. And nobody really thinks about the plumbing until it's broken. and then we'll have a real problem. And so the whole report really takes a detailed look at the issues, and it does so in an unbiased way, in a neutral way. It's to say, what is the problem? How can it be fixed? And I think when you look at these two quotes, I think they really sum up the extent of the problem. Diversity in approaches as to how people do things. And it's about this ad hoc evolution of a system. So you go back 20 years or so and people start with a sort of system, and then somebody makes a request or a bit of legislation changes, or there's an efficiency to be had somewhere, and there's a little tweak, and the cumulative is what we have today. And I think this is very telling. Nobody, if they were to sit down today and design the proxy system, would have built what we have today. And so essentially it tells us that there's a fundamental problem that needs to be resolved. And when you then think about the next quote, the medium of getting a proxy vote distributed from the end investor down the chain is a web of messy intermediaries handling and processing data from one intermediary to the next. It creates time delays, inconsistency in interpretation, data corruption, and a lack of transparency and extra expense. And you think, wow, that is a damning indictment of a system. And when we think about the technology that we have today, so the Minister made reference to fintech. If you think about companies that we see globally, I can sit in my house, pick from just about any product in the world, and it can be delivered to my door tomorrow. And we can't get a system where votes can be passed from one end of the chain to the other. That is really quite telling, and it has to change. And one of the reasons I think that we end up here is a sort of psychosocial phenomena called the bystander effect. And within sort of social psychology, then there is a lot of evidence to show that if you to see an incident happen, for example, somebody getting robbed, if it was just you and somebody committing the crime and somebody being the victim, you're quite likely to intervene. But as the number of people witnessing the problem gets bigger, then you're less likely to intervene. And so if you look at from the miners' report to today, I think there is widespread acknowledgement across the industry, from asset owners all the way through, that there is a problem. But we have this interesting issue, which is up until essentially today, nobody was willing to intervene, and nobody was willing to really push the system to be better. And so hopefully we see a way past this now, because it is fundamental to the long-term sustainability of not just pensions, but UK PLC, the asset management industry, and also sort of a more sustainable world. So in terms of the conclusions of the report, I think probably the most important one is that the barriers that are observed, current and historical, are not insurmountable. And there are instances where fund managers are in pooled funds splitting out the vote. And so essentially we're at a point where we can say quite comfortably, this can be done. And so that's quite clear from the evidence, and that's an important step. There are barriers, but they can all be resolved. Now, within all of this, there is always a tension, and it's a chicken and egg problem. And Janice alluded to it as well. If there was a demand by clients, then we would do this. And actually, if you go back 20 years, probably that demand wasn't there in the same way. But now, I think, given some of the regulation we see coming out of TPR, some of the things that we're seeing coming down around TCFD, and a more general awareness of the importance of pension fund investments in particular, and what this means for climate change, then this isn't an issue where inertia is an acceptable position. And so that inertia is no longer a challenge, because things are changing and things must change. But what that does mean is that the long-term underinvestment, which everybody spoke about in the voting system, that has to change. And so the technology that enables and empowers asset owners to start to develop their own policies, engage with their asset managers, engage with their investment consultants, and then have a policy which can be implemented to the benefit of the fund and the beneficiaries. I think that is the next thing that has to happen. The infrastructure has to be improved. The final thing is that this has to be done in collaboration. It cannot be done just by trustees. It cannot be done just by asset managers or investment consultants. Everybody's involved in this. And starting yesterday and for the next 2 weeks, I will be randomly dipping into A4S, Accounting for Sustainability. It's their and the climate emergency. When we think about biodiversity, when we think about the post-pandemic world, and when we think about the massive amounts of capital that sit in pension funds, there are two different things that are clearly important. One is improving the companies that are already in existence and helping move towards better disclosure for TCFD so we can make more proactive investment choices, and also trying to target something for Paris Accord so we actually don't end up with catastrophic climate change. Just now, I think the rough estimate for UK pension funds is we're targeting 3.8 degrees. So essentially we're on course just now for a climate catastrophe. We need to get to at least 2, if not 1.5, which is Paris. That requires asset owners to be able to be engaged, and it requires them to be effective stewards so they can improve the outcomes of the companies that are already in existence and start to allocate company to those businesses that are going to help us move into a greener low carbon economy. And so part of that effective stewardship is the vote. It's one lever that they have, and so we're now at a point where this becomes much more pressing, because if this cannot be resolved, then essentially we're losing time against something which is much more significant than the current pandemic. So hopefully the report will enable this to go forward, and I think Simon is going to talk about some of the key recommendations now. And I will stop sharing my screen. You're on mute, Janice.
Thanks, Ian. I was saying, so now over to Simon.
Thanks, Janice. Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to have been asked by the Minister for Pensions to chair the task force on pension scheme voting implementation. He has explained why it is systemically important, and I want to echo his thinking. I'm very happy to be working with and on behalf of trustees. Wearing a variety of hats, I've now met hundreds of pension fund trustees, and I know that what we have with trustees and what the AMNT has in abundance is integrity, common sense, and a desire to do their best. And that is why when AMNT members who are informed, sharp, and are doing the job on a voluntary basis with no axe to grind, when people like that have complained to me about financial services firms, I've always felt uneasy. I had learnt that the odds were heavily that the trustee was in the right. One topic in particular, which was very uncomfortable, was trustees and voting. It seems blindingly obvious to me that the wishes of the asset owner must be considered in voting the shares, and indeed, if push comes to shove, what the owner wants should be the only factor. Now, when I've asked about this in quiet conversations with financial services people, I've had exactly the same issues raised as the Minister's referred to and as Professor Clatcher's referred to. Technology, voting as one voice, legal structure. Well, having read the Clatcher report and the recent Law Commission report, I am sceptical. I don't think there is an insuperable problem. I think the argument is right. Owners should be able to direct voting. And as I say, there are no problems, no insuperable problems. I'm starting from the position stated in the task force name. We are implementing what needs to be done. We are not debating. But our aim will be to reach consensus across the voting chain on various issues, and I think that consensus can be reached. I'll focus on two aspects. In particular, on the trustees setting the voting policy, it can be reached because of two marvellous British inventions, fiduciary duty and comply or explain. As previous speakers have said, I don't think there is much doubt now that pension fiduciaries have a duty to consider how their assets are voted. So what trustees want and what the pension system needs to deliver in order to produce the benefits the Minister has referred to is for trustees to have the ability to set a policy and to be sure that their guidelines are acted on. Now, this task force is not going to set those guidelines. We too are looking at the implementation, at the plumbing, as Professor Clatcher's termed it. The setting of the guidelines may be a job for the Council of UK Pension Schemes, which was suggested last week. But clearly, for the guidelines to be effective in lifting standards, in preserving value, in creating value for pension schemes and beneficiaries, they need to cover a wide range of issues: climate, diversity, integrity and pay. And I think it was interesting the Minister focused in on pay in his remarks. I think trustees will set guidelines at the level of best practice and will say to their agents, make sure our votes are cast in accordance with these instructions, not requests, instructions. But the trustees will go further because they want it to work for the benefit of the system. They will say, for instance, to fund managers, we are not expert, you are. We have set the strategy, but you implement it. If on anything at all you think we should vote contrary to these instructions, vote that way, but tell us you've done it and tell us why you did it. And yes, that's the second aspect of it. It's comply or explain, a proven, well understood practice, which can make this possible very easily. So the industry should be able to adapt. Trustees will give instructions, and if those instructions are to act in accordance with best practice, and Janice has reminded us that that's how the red lines, for instance, were set. If fund managers and voting advisory firms also intend to deliver best practice outcomes, there is an obvious alignment there between the owner and the agent. If anyone can tell me why that cannot work, please do so. I hope the consensus on the principle of trustees setting policies will form very soon. The Minister mentioned early 2021. I am not sure we need a consensus on how long it should take for individual agents to be able to accept instructions. When the fund managers and service providers make their stewardship code reports, the market will soon see who has the flexibility, the managerial skills, and the necessary client focus. Conversely, red flags will be raised over those that don't. People will rightly ask, just how good are their systems? How focused is their management? Do they even understand what their clients, the pension fund trustees, are now required to do? Now, the task force will need to consider the issue of split voting on pooled funds and how we get that better implemented. This is one of the issues Professor Clatcher looked at in detail and which the Law Commission considered briefly. To sum up what the Minister has said and what the Professor has said, no game-changing impediment to split voting has been found. There may be problems in individual firms in the voting chain, but I'm sure no one is suggesting we hold back necessary progress at the industry level just for one firm or two firms. We recognise split voting may give problems to some, and we're sympathetic to the pain in operational areas that will result from this extension in client needs. But I think the clients will be sympathetic too. If they see adaptation underway, they will probably stay. If they see resistance, I think they will move. But as Professor Clatcher has just said, and as perhaps many of the service providers on this call will realise, things are already moving. We may already be seeing coalitions of the willing emerging. Split voting is happening. Professor Clatcher's already given us some nuggets from his report. I'll just quote one. The barriers aren't legal or technical, it's just a willingness to do it. One asset manager made a concession fairly early on, and we could direct our UK voting. That's a quote from the head of governance at a large pension fund. And that confirms what isn't a secret anymore. Fund managers can and do split the vote in pooled funds for some clients. It can be done, and it is done. It is confirmed in the recent Law Commission report. For example, we have been told that it is practically difficult, although not impossible, to enable split voting on a pooled fund. Excuse me. In fact, split voting seems to be cropping up everywhere. The Friends Provident Foundation recently ran an RFP process for a £33 million mandate. 4 of the bidders offered split voting. There are many pension funds with that quantum of equities in pooled funds. Split voting on your pooled funds is already being offered. Further up the size range, Nest was able to instruct voting in a pooled fund before moving to a segregated mandate. Many in the sector are aware of other large funds that can get their wishes executed in pooled funds. Minerva, for instance, is working with schemes to do bespoke voting with their fund managers. And in the short period of time I've been looking at the issue again, I've been told of 2 institutional scale new products being planned. Reference has already been made to developments in what we might call the retail orientated areas. Tumulo is developing a product that lets investors tell their fund manager how they would like them to vote. It's opinion polling, but the recognition of the owner's interest is interesting, and you've heard the minister's remarks on it. Citizen Shareholders is developing a product that would allow savers to instruct their fund managers how to vote. So I suspect that pooled fund voting is here, but that it's not being talked about. Perhaps the immediate consensus required in this area is that people do talk about it, that we need to change the culture of silence, and that is something we'll be looking at very soon. I look forward to helping the significant developments in pension fund voting that are necessary and which are imminent. I think it's clear the Minister expects us and the sector to deliver. I'd like to salute Janice Turner and her AMNT colleagues, especially Leanne Clements and David Weeks, for the role they've played in bringing this about. And I'd like to congratulate Professor Clatchett on his report. In particular, I'd like to thank the Minister for kicking this important work off. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Simon, and also thank you, Ian, as well. So now we have a few minutes left for questions, and the first hand that I saw was from Mike Clark of Ario Advisory. But before he asks his question, I've had a request. Could everybody who isn't one of the speakers, could they please turn off their cameras, because it'll help to preserve bandwidth, because I know some people are finding it quite difficult to keep their signal going. So if people could do that, that would be really great. So over to Mike Clark.
Thanks, Janice. I would just like to add a note of excitement to all this. Picking up on Simon's remarks, we can do this. I've got form in this area, and I suspect that 10 years from now, when your successors look back on 20 years of AMNT, we will see today as equivalent, sorry Fiona, to the establishment of the PRI. This initiative is really going to make a difference. One data point, when I helped a select committee raise this with the FCA on the back of earlier AMNT work, they rather kicked it into the long grass, and I'm simply suggesting that our excellent minister has found the lawnmower. So let us add some excitement to this. Thank you.
Great. Would Ian or Simon like to respond to that?
I think it is important, Mike, and we will be reaching out to a wide range of people for input, in particular trustees. We want to hear from trustees. We want to flag what people are already doing. We want to flag what their ambition is. We will reach out widely.
That's great. Ian, can I ask you, when you were doing this research, I mean, you did an enormous amount of research on this. So what was the most sort of striking observation that you had when you were talking to different parts of the voting chain?
I think it was the fact that everybody said, yeah, this is a problem to varying degrees, or a challenge to varying degrees. And that, I mean, if you think about the amount of money that's invested in pension funds and the acceptance of the value of stewardship, and obviously voting being a part of that, the fact that everybody said, well, it's not a great system, underinvestment, I thought that was really stark.
Yeah. Do we have any more? Do we have any more questions? If we don't, it seems that we're probably going to finish absolutely on time. So back over to David Weeks then.
Well, thank you to several people. Thank you firstly to the Minister. Thank you to you, Janice. Thank you to Ian and Simon for their contributions to the debate. I think we've had a very fruitful discussion. You comment at the start about 10 years. This is the way we mark our 10 years, a programme of action and follow-up with other parts of the industry. So very satisfactory conclusion. Thank you all very much indeed for joining us on this occasion. I declare the conference as an end.
Okay, thanks very much, David.